Welcome to another edition of Global Tax Talk. I'm Giorgia Maffini and I'm here in London, joined by Eugen Trombitas, PwC Indirect Tax Policy Leader. Welcome, Eugen.
Thanks, Giorgia. Great to be with you.
So the OECD's Pillar 1 initiative aims to reallocate taxing rights to market jurisdictions, as well as removing existing digital services taxes, the DSTs. The Multilateral Convention to implement Amount A of Pillar 1, the MLC, may or may not come into fruition. There is, as we all know, significant speculation about its future. So some countries have already implemented unilateral measures, and additional countries are in fact contemplating new tax policy actions should Pillar 1 fail. So let's start from a high-level snapshot of where we are now. The number of DSTs around the world has expanded. DSTs are generally taxes on gross revenues generating from specific digital services, with the most popular having been advertising services, digital intermediary activities that connect through a platform different users, and sales of users' data. For example, Canada's DST entered into force early this year with a retroactive effect back to 2022. But the US recently invoked dispute resolution settlement procedures against the Canadian DST. New Zealand has drafted DST legislation, and many other countries, especially in Europe, have in the last 4 years at least raised the question of whether a DST should be introduced. But at the same time, some countries are moving away from a DST to a significant economic presence concept. This is the example of Kenya, even though we all know it's difficult to then attribute income to that significant economic presence concept. But Eugen, we have seen in this context also countries trying to introduce less controversial measures, and in particular, they have introduced VAT measures. What are you seeing at the moment, and why countries have gone down that road?
Yeah, look, thanks, Giorgia. It's a fascinating time in global policy, and I'm very happy to reflect on the VAT policy side of things. So the VAT policy makers did have to think about this very difficult dilemma of how do you tax the digital economy when you've got offshore sellers and local consumers. And in the end, the policy decision was quite simple. You pay the tax in the place of location of the consumer, and we make the offshore vendor or the platform pay. So that's the policy design. And what's going on in behind that policy design is the concept of neutrality and not to distort. So we treat e-commerce businesses from a VAT point of view the same as any local business, and we don't target certain businesses. So that's by policy design. And if you think about it intuitively, you've got a consumption tax. Where do you tax consumption? In the place where things are consumed. So people are on board with that concept because of its simplicity. Taxpayers think it's fair, and that's why you've got a popular group of 100 plus countries with these rules, following the OECD guidelines, I might add, on a consistent basis. So this is why it's been a popular choice, because quite a lot of work actually went in to making the design right. You say less controversial, but quite a lot of work went into it. And another feature of the design was to try and make it as simple as possible to pay. So it's an efficient tax. It's a pay-only tax if you're making sales in the jurisdiction. Quarterly returns, simple registration process. I will talk about some little practical challenges later in the segment, but that's the essence of the design in relation to VAT.
Thank you very much, Eugen. That's very, very interesting. So just to level set a little bit here now, where do you see the VAT landscape going at the moment?
Yeah, look, good question. So it's good to reflect, obviously, on where the policy has got us to. So in terms of low-value goods rules, so these are items of goods that are less than several $100s, and services rules where we tax the offshore seller or the platform. We have well-formed rules generating significant revenue globally. So VAT has been a popular choice, and I've mentioned a number of countries that have taken those rules on board. So just a little bit about each of the rules. With services, it wasn't all immediate. We had certain regions leading the way, like Europe and South Africa. That was then followed by the Asia-Pac region, LATAM, and just in recent times, Africa's really booming with these rules, as is the Middle East. So the entire globe is liking these rules, and it's actually quite a standout feature, particularly in relation to services. When you look at the stats and over 100 countries and more to come, both developing and developed countries like the rules. So there's quite a lot of harmony, and this is why it is a bit of a standout feature of the international tax landscape. So that's certainly on the services side. On the goods side, look, about 1/3 of the countries that have brought in the services rules have got low-value goods rules, which require the offshore supplier to collect the VAT. The reason why that's growing a little bit slower is that goods transactions are a bit more complicated. You have issues with supply chain and, parcels having high-value goods and low-value goods, and how do you deal with that? And then customs requires different documentation in different countries to assess whether VAT's been paid so that no duty is paid. So there's a bit more going on with the goods side. And then finally, there's an emerging issue with platforms and the gig and sharing economy. So this is playing out through VIDA, which has slowed down because of the compromise discussions in relation to the platform rules. And this is to do with facilitating ride sharing and short-term accommodation. We've actually covered that in a separate global tax talk. Some countries have found a solution, but the solution is really around full liability or information sharing. So there's quite a rich landscape on the VAT side. And I guess just thinking back to your discussion earlier and Pillar 1 and the impact it might have, could you enlighten us a little bit about practical challenges and actions businesses need to be taking?
So if we focus on DSTs, what we are seeing companies doing at the moment is mainly thinking about the compliance aspects of DSTs, which mainly have to do with understanding the scope of DSTs and where to gather the data to calculate the tax base. And recently we have seen that tax authorities are not always consistent in the interpretation of these 2 points across time. Then, as we said before, digital services taxes are gross taxes, so they will impact the margin. This is particularly problematic for low margin businesses and for loss-making businesses, of course. So companies are reflecting upon the question of whether the cost of the tax can be passed on along the value chain, whether the tax impacts growth in certain markets. And overall, as you can imagine, companies are monitoring which countries have a DST, which countries are likely to implement soon, and certainly there is a lot of focus on the differences in DSTs across countries.
Great. Well, we're seeing similar things in VAT. So although I've described a bed of roses earlier, there are practical challenges, and keeping on top of the legislative updates is important if you're a business with a global footprint. So just a couple of recent changes. For example, South Africa is going from taxing both B and C transactions to C only, and Japan is going to bring in platforms. All of these changes are coming in from 2025. And often, as a business expands, it's good to reflect on their footprint. But actually, you start with, in relation to services, what services am I actually providing? Do the rules apply to these services? Now, many services are taxed, but some are not. Like some countries don't tax insurance, for example. Many countries don't tax crypto transactions, but they tax non-fungible tokens. And of course, there's some new fees emerging because of some other tax reforms and changes. And so if you charge new service fees, you need to be really on top of how do the VAT rules apply to those service fees, and how do you embed that in your system. There's another issue. We've talked about platforms, and the headline news is that platforms are liable, but actually you have to work out if you're a platform who's covered by the marketplace definitions. So click-through platforms who advertise only or who only process payments are typically not covered by these rules. So that's important to bear in mind. And just another practical challenge across the globe is working out, am I supplying B customers or C customers? And how do I evidence that, and what's the country requirement to evidence that, and sometimes the country requirements change. So these are all the practical things that are in the mix. And you mentioned earlier, business model changes, really important. If you're selling services only, but then start selling goods or vice versa, you really need to assess how the VAT rules apply, because we have so many countries with these rules now. And then I think finally, I should say that the landscape is not just about tax to pay or tax collection. There's e-invoicing changes that are coming unilaterally or through the likes of VIDA once it's approved. Then you have a lot more obligations on platforms around data sharing and information reporting. Think DAC7, CSOP. So there's a lot going on that you need to think about the impact of and how you need to embed that in your system. And we found that companies are looking to lean on technology a lot more as they change their processes to deal with all this global change.
Those are great insights, Eugen. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for joining us. For more information, be sure to listen to Will Morris every week for 60 seconds on key global tax policy insights. We will be back soon with another episode of Global Tax Talk. In the meantime, thanks for tuning in so you can stay global tax ready.